I don't generally talk about video games on this channel. I do play them a decent amount, and I might talk about them a bit in the future, but I generally consider this channel's focus to be on books, and that's not going to change. That said, I've been playing Fire Emblem since I was 9, and since then, for better or worse, each game's release has felt like an event to me. For that reason, and because I think this is one particularly interesting event, I want to talk about Fire Emblem Engage. You'll note that the footage you're seeing isn't from Engage. That is both because I don't want to put spoilers in here, and more importantly, because I can't be bothered to buy a Switch capture card, so you're just seeing a recent challenge run I did in Path of Radiance. I figured it was at least a little more appropriate than just a video of my face. I say I think this one is interesting because Engage epitomizes the dichotomy that is my relationship with the Fire Emblem franchise. The gameplay is spectacular, innovative in the series formula, improving on a core loop I already loved. The map design is excellent, difficulty is creatively made interesting. It is, from a gameplay perspective, one of, if not the best experiences in the series, especially in those earlier chapters. On the flip side, it is one of the greatest narrative failures to come out of a series whose stories have been nothing special at their best and comically bad at their worst. Now, there's a good bit more nuance in my opinion on Engage's story, so while I do ultimately consider it a narrative failure, if you're shaking your head in disgust, stick around. It might not be for the reasons you think. Before we get into gameplay, I'll start with the shortest points on visuals and music. I appreciate that Engage has more artistic vision than Three Houses did. The series peaked closest to my personal aesthetic preferences, somewhere on the spectrum between the GBA era and Radiant Dawn, and the subsequent animeification of the series hasn't been entirely up my alley. That said, the more unique designs in Engage beat Three Houses for the vision alone, whether or not I'm a fan of the specific shape that vision takes, and both Switch games are head and shoulders above the semi-chibi sprites we had in the 3DS era. It also helps that cutscenes and renders look nicer across the board, and while I don't love all character designs, the settings look spectacular consistently. The music in every Fire Emblem game slaps, and this one is no exception. I'd say here it doesn't quite go as hard as Three Houses or the Tellius games, but it's still really good. That's all obviously much more subject to taste, though, but the opening song might just be bad. I'm not sure how much taste comes into play there. So now to start with a brief gameplay note, I'm happy with the return of a more strict class system. You can still use second seals and emblems to get your units into whatever class you want, but because that training isn't built into something like the monastery, each character feels like they belong more uniquely in a specific class. I don't like the class flexibility in Three Houses that much. It's cool from a customizability perspective, but I found that it made all the units feel a lot more similar to each other. There wasn't that same level of distinction between them that we get in some of the earlier games. I'd still prefer something even stricter than what we get in Engage, but I consider it a step in the right direction. At the time of writing this, I've beaten the game once on Hard Classic, and I'm a good bit over halfway through a second run on Maddening. I want to start off by talking about the gameplay, what I like and what I don't. First, I should say that I was disappointed but not surprised to see the returns of both casual mode and the turnwheel, or time crystal as it's known in Engage. I have no issue with Intelligent Systems making their games more accessible to more casual players. In fact, I think it's great that they're doing that, and that that's clearly something that they're invested in doing. But I do take issue with the way it's handled. This is really a discussion for another video I want to make at some point, but to me, engaging with the permadeath mechanic is central to the Fire Emblem experience, and the inclusion of ever more systems designed to circumvent it is one of the greatest tragedies of the series. Not only does it push players away from that engagement, but it hampers developers' ability to innovate further with that central mechanic. I'll cut myself off before this digression becomes an entire video essay, but if you disagree with this idea, say why in the comments and you'll either convince me or I'll make a counter-argument in video form. Fortunately, as far as pure gameplay gripes go, that's about it. Otherwise, the game is fantastically designed. I'll break my praise down by categories a bit. The braking mechanic, wherein a unit attacking with weapon triangle advantage disables their target's ability to counter for this and the next combat, is great. It turns Engage into a much more player-faced focused game, which generally feels either more luck-based like FE6 or like it allows for more skill expression. Fortunately, Engage follows into the second camp. Next, a lot of games in the series try to introduce new mechanics, and I often find that they either feel underwhelming, like Biorhythm and Crests, or completely balance destroying, like Awakening Pair-Up. The new additions in Engage are perfect, though. First, we'll look at the changes to unit types. In a clear attempt to bring the rest of the classes up to the level of Cavaliers and Flyers, who have so dominated the tops of tier lists for most of the games in the series, Engage adds Backup, Armored, Covert, or Arcane traits. These are inherent characteristics of different classes and allow units to chain attack, avoid being broken, double their own, or ignore enemy terrain avoid bonuses, respectively. These all add massive utility to non-mounted units and seriously balance out the strengths of the cast while not making Cavs or Flyers any less fun to use. The larger of the additions are the emblems, which just feel so good. The stat buffs make them feel like they're always a worthwhile equip, but after you activate an emblem on a unit, you get access to various passive bonuses, powerful extra weapons, and one uncounterable and often very powerful attack, or an equally powerful non-combat active ability in some cases. These range from striking repeatedly at close range for insane damage, a 10-range bow Astra, 4-way dance, global team full heal. They're insane. Engage abilities are so powerful, but can only be used at best once every 3 turns, and that requires very intentional unit placement and optimization. This is fantastic design, giving players an insanely powerful ability that can be optimized in its use and its frequency, incentivizing all kinds of interesting and creative gameplay. This is one of the many ways that Engage encourages its players to play well and to explore interesting strategies. Not to mention that it just feels really damn good to use such powerful abilities. It's a dopamine rush every time you pull them out, and possibly an even bigger rush to figure out just when and how to do it. The map design is also a cut above Three Houses. Enemy placement feels intentional, minor objectives like forts and other terrain feel more important, both thanks to their placement relative to enemy groups and the bonuses they give to covert units. The tiles that recharge your engage meter figure even more importantly, and the addition of backup units on the enemy side make careful placement even more important than ever to avoid being surrounded and chipped down by chain attacks, while reinforcing what a difficult game this is to dominate on enemy phase. Many bosses have 2, 3, or even 4 health bars in a better implemented version of the demonic beasts from Three Houses. This rules. It makes them feel like real meaningful encounters. In older games, it was commonplace to get your carry out on the front and one-round the boss easily. That happens rarely on hard and even less on maddening and engage, which ups the difficulty again by giving the boss Veteran Plus, a skill that makes them unbreakable and immune to effective weapon damage. I think this is a fantastic change. With proper planning and use of engage skills, I've managed to chew through both or even all 3 of a boss's health bars in a single player phase, even on maddening, but it requires much more careful thought and planning than just bungaing in with Har and one-rounding Lombroso, really incentivizing good play, which is obviously great. It doubles by just feeling good because these boss fights now feel meaningfully like real boss fights are supposed to, important and powerful in a way that few since Radiant Dawn Endgame really have. I will say that I think the frequency with which they're deployed lessens that a little bit. There aren't many chapters where you get a reprieve that make the big bosses feel meaningfully stronger than just a regular boss, but we'll get to that a little bit more in the second part of the video. We also have to talk first about the balance of difficulty. First, my just overall thoughts on difficulty would say hard mode is harder than its counterpart in Three Houses, it's harder than Sacred Stones and Path of Radiance hard mode, but it's easier than most of the others. Maddening mode, on the other hand, is easier than Three Houses maddening mode so far, but still offers a solid challenge, especially as we get into the mid and late game, which is another point of praise. Most Fire Emblem games have heavily front-loaded difficulty, with the game getting easier and easier as you train up your units. You can just steamroll it in the late game. Think of the difference between the first few Dawn Brigade chapters and steamrolling Radiant Dawn Part 3 with Har, or the difference between struggling through FE6 Chapter 7 and shitting on the game with your promoted Rutger and Milady just a bit later. Engage feels much more balanced. If anything, the opening is the easy part, with mid and late games seriously ramping up difficulty. They manage this by letting enemies keep pace with your units much better and slowing experience gain. To counteract the concern of soft-locking unprepared players, they give you the option to lower but not to raise your difficulty mid-playthrough. A good choice to have, especially if it allows them to be so unforgiving with the late-game difficulty curve. It feels genuinely challenging all the way through, and I think that rules. There are a bunch of other things I like too. The equipment upgrading system is cool. The Somniel feels less obligatory and simultaneously more interesting than the Monastery did in Three Houses. Crit animations are simultaneously better and less intrusive. The Swordmaster crit especially goes hard. I'm sure there are a bunch of other things that I'm not thinking of, but this should be enough to convince you that, from a gameplay perspective, Engage slaps. Now it's time to be a bit more negative. Engage's story is really dumb. That shouldn't be surprising. It's not like any of the games in the series have genuinely good stories, though at least Sacred Stone's Gaiden and Genealogy tried. I'd say the first point against it is that it is yet again the same skeleton that basically every Fire Emblem game has. Royals ousted from or threatened in power, ally with dragon to fight a war against bigger, badder dragon or demon god thing allied with an evil wizard. There's only so much you can do with that structure, and I would really love to see them break away from it one of these days. Of course, you're probably saying, what did you expect? It's Fire Emblem. And that's fair. I can hope, but realistically, that skeleton was always what we were going to get. What I'm really unhappy with is the flesh that accompanies it. Gross. Before I talk about the rotting, fetid bits of story flesh, I want to talk about a few of the things I like. Narratively, a Fire Emblem game's main strength typically comes from its characters, particularly their interactions in ancillary moments, because the central plot is never really the strength. From what I've seen, I think Engage does this stuff quite well, especially in supports. I haven't paid too much attention because I don't care as much about supports as some other players do. That's not a criticism, it's just, personal preference stuff. But the few that I've read have been perfectly good, continuing in the Awakening and Fates tradition of actually having decent characterization outside the terrible central story. Another point in Engage's favor is that unlike FE7 or FE6 or Radiant Dawn Parts 3 and 4 or Awakening or Fates or probably a bunch of others, it actually seems to understand that its central plot is dumb. It leans into the camp and makes it kind of funny and enjoyable at times. Obviously, Fates and Awakening do this a little bit too, and even Radiant Dawn does it a tad in Part 4, but Engage is doing this on a whole new level. It's really leaning into the camp. It knows what it's doing, and that can be enjoyable. Obviously, I'd take a good plot if I could get it, but a plot that's bad and self-aware is better than a plot that tries to be good and eats shit in the attempt. With all these positives and comparisons to other games, you might wonder why I started out so negative on Engage's story, and we're getting to that. But to make this point, I'm going to have to spoil not explicit story events, but at least some expectations. First, before I do that, I'll make my arguments a bit more abstractly. Fire Emblem games have never been amazing at integrating gameplay and story. Route splits from Sacred Stones to the present have just been text menus that have nothing to do with the way you play the game, and even in FE6, it was just like random, arbitrary behind-the-scenes stuff. For example, as always, people will point out that Kaga did it better, and yes, that's true. FE5 has, I think, the best integration of gameplay and story of the series, but for one thing, that game came out before I was born, and for another, it was not the best. There are other games in other genres and other series that do the integration better. That said, it's not like Fire Emblem has always been terrible at integration. In fact, I would say they've never really been horrible at it. Each in-game accomplishment typically comes with a decent sense of narrative progression. You beat the boss, you get across the bridge, you escape the prison, whatever it is, it usually feels like the thing you just did in the game mattered to the story. That's really important. It might be the most important part of storytelling in the interactive medium, creating the illusion that the player impacts the story. Engage fails utterly in this. They do not maintain the illusion, and it starts with Chapter 7. From here, again, we won't be spoiling plot, but if you don't want even the slightest expectation spoiler, skip to the timestamp in the description. Throughout the latter 3/4 of the game, the player is pursued by a set of 4 bosses and 3 other characters allied with them. These characters all figure in similarly to the 4 Riders of Dan, Izuka, the Black Fang, you get the idea. If you've played these games, you know the character type. Unlike other games, however, where these characters chase you, you escape, or otherwise narrowly avoid fighting them. In Engage, you fight occasionally one, but more typically a set of several of these characters in most of the chapters for the latter chunk of the game. These characters are the bosses who you specifically defeat in chapters 7, 8, 9, 10, 14, 16, 17, 19, 20, 21, and 23. 11 out of a total 25 chapters in the game. So you specifically attack, surround, and defeat this character. They lay disarmed and broken at your feet. Then the battle ends, the game leaves the player's control, and they get up and run away, often taking their emblem ring or leaving behind only one of several, and you just let them so they can go on to fuck you over in the next chapter too, and the next one after that. I talked about the importance of the illusion that the player's actions have an impact on the story. This is not just a break, it is illusion destroying. It is its death. Every moment that you spend frustrated with one chapter, you'll just ask yourself, man, everyone's always talking about how perfect and great this avatar is. If I'm really so great, why didn't I kill this dipshit the last 5 times I beat them? Not only does it raise questions like this, but it utterly destroys the significance of each other victory. Okay, I just won this fight. I defeated the big bad enemy. So what? What have I actually accomplished? I'm just going to have to fight them again. It's all just dressing for getting one emblem ring, something that often happens independently of your beating the bosses and moving to a new location. In Radiant Dawn, for all that that game's story goes down the toilet in later parts, still feels like you've accomplished something after clearing a map. Sure, some of the bosses are minor characters, but each chapter, each objective marks a meaningful progression of the plot. Similarly, these Four Riders type bosses are supposed to represent events, obstacles that it feels satisfying to overcome. Path of Radiance shows you Patrine and the Black Knight early on. It teases them in the story so that when you ultimately face them, design quality of the Black Knight fight aside, it feels like a proper showdown, not some half-assed 5th time beating the same idiot into the ground. The bosses in Engage barely feel like narrative threats. I've dealt with them before and I'll do it again. Why should I care if they're here? What threat do they pose? So yes, Engage's story at its core isn't any worse than Awakening or Blazing Blade, but it fails to establish a genuine sense of player interaction with the story, and a sense of meaningful threat from its main bosses. It is a narratively empty experience. It is never a world to get lost in, never a chapter to get invested in beyond its mechanical consequences. Out of the entire series, only Engage fails to ever feel like anything more than a game.